Hi, Stephen. Hi, Patrice. Hi, Deb. Hi, Stina. Juliana. Jessica. Corrine. Karen. And Erica from Thailand. Maybe we should just have some time with Erica from Thailand. And who needs a who needs a talk on rebirth when we could just talk to Erica in Thailand? Hi, Sabina. Okay, guys. Just let a couple people roll in. Panos, hi, Stu. Are you okay, Stu? I haven't seen you in a while. Are you good?
Yes, I am. Good
Okay.
to see you
You
and
too.
everybody else.
All right, so. Okay, let's get started because I actually don't know how long the presentation will be for today, and I know everybody's got various things. So today is the fourth and final installment of our Sensemaking the Pandemic series. We had a great array of guests and perspectives. I just want to thank an anonymous donor that made those lectures and guests visits possible. And we started in September with Anderson Todd and his lecture on Jung. And then in October, we had the visit of Lynn Bell for astrology. And last month, we had Ian Baker visiting to talk about the Shambhala prophecy. And I'm concluding here in December, just before our break, with a presentation on mythology, which is not my area of expertise, but it is the area of utmost interest to me as I'm writing this book. So I thought I would put some slides together for you and use it as an opportunity to refine some of my thinking and also refresh some of the concepts that we have shared together, for example, in course number 3 of the Contemplative Studies Immersion, Return by the Elixir. And those of you that were part of that group, we went through some atypical or unconventional themes and tried to integrate them with Buddhism. So I'm going to, in a way, try to do something similar to that, integrating themes from mythology, Jung, and alchemy. So we'll see how it goes. But the reason for all of these lectures during the last few months is to help us unhinge ourselves from the very narrow and pervasive narratives, the binary narratives that are going on in sort of polarized political echo chambers. So that's my hope, is that somehow through Jung, you can redirect your inquiry to see reality from another point of view. Not that it is the only point of view or the quote unquote correct point of view, but another one that can at least dislodge you from circling around in an eddy. And also, it's not just circling around in an eddy. Think about the kind of emotions that are stirred up as a result of the kind of view or perspective we are indoctrinated into. This, I think, is part of our contemplative practice. It doesn't have to be an overt challenge, but at least a consideration. What is going on in my world today? What kind of lenses, what kinds of lenses am I seeing through? Are they helpful? So before I launch the presentation, there's one little bit of one question I'd like to raise for you, and that is the last 300 years of Western civilization. What myths have emerged? What compelling myths have emerged? If you can write those down in the chat, the ones that come up on the top of your head, I'd be curious what you come up with. And while that's going on, I'm going to just set up the presentation. I I think it goes without saying that I want to thank Allison for creating the space of the courtyard. I've enjoyed many of the informal discussions that some of you have participated in. I hope those are helpful for you. I think not having a particular theme and just letting the dialogue emerge, I think that's been very constructive. And I want to thank all those that are dropping in every once in a while, or those steady folk who come into the courtyard. It's a nice addition to stay together through thick and thin. Okay, so I'm going to really focus on Rebirth, which I think is sort of the archetypal ocean that we're swimming in right now. Whether you paid attention to some of the last lectures, there's a very strong and compelling thread that unites all the talks that have come in. Most obvious, the astrology of right now. We are in the thrust of a major transition. And that's the most cosmological or widest lens that we can take on the contemporary situation, that we are in the decline or dissolution of a paradigm, of an epoch. Whether you take the 2012 predictions, prophecies of the Mayan calendar, or other types of prophecies like the one introduced last time by Ian Baker, the Shambhala prophecy, or you have an astrologer as astute as Lynn come in and talk about the paradigm shift from the so-called Piscean to the Aquarian age. Even if that time span, that tidal or tide shift takes 150 odd years, we are amidst that. And that will surely outlive our own singular lifetime. But nevertheless, this is in some way a larger demise or decay or dissolution, and that's making the way for something new to come out. And we are players in that matrix. Whether we're active players, conscious players, or we are being spat out unconsciously in the turbulence, that's for each of us to determine. That much we have some agency over. And then if you just take it down to the individual, those of you that have lost your business early in the last 18 months of the pandemic, those of you that broke ties with somebody or some institution, those of you that were sick yourself or had someone else sick, even had someone die, came to your own near death. These are the personal forms of the archetype. They're all opportunities to reevaluate old structures in our own minds that have up until now been useful to hold us together, but now have outlived their course. And so I know so many people that are making probably the most radical adjustment of their lives right now, using the opportunity. Erica being a very powerful example of that, someone who we were celebrating 18 months ago as being a frontline worker in New York City, being right there in the thick of it, also being exhausted by the influx of cases, now has, in a way, radically shifted her view on her work and her life, and has taken leave and taken absence, and has set out to be a traveler in the midst of pandemics. I think this represents a very compelling way that emptiness can be applied, not one to be bashful and not one to be afraid of the opportunity, but to seize the opportunity to make a radical change. This, I think, is very emblematic of the use of mythology. So I'm going to start by giving us a few rubrics of consideration. As I said, I was going to do a little bit of review from Return with the Elixir, some lenses that we can try on. I will then go into the archetype of rebirth proper, and then I'm going to introduce a myth that I'm, to be perfectly transparent, not all that familiar with. So you'll forgive me, and maybe some of you are more familiar with the Demeter and Persephone myth from ancient Greece, but we'll use that as a stepping stone. And then we will get into initiation and pilgrimage. So let's get started. Myths are public dreams, and dreams are private myths. By finding your own dream and following it through, it will lead you to the myth world in which you live. But just as in a dream, the subject and the object, though they seem to be separate, are really one and the same. This is a very compelling quote from Joe Campbell as a starting point about the power of myth. And in my estimation, I didn't read the chats how many of you came up with a modern myth. There are very few conscious myths to draw on in Western civilization because, in a way, my contention is that as a result of the pendulum's swing to science, we have abandoned our mythology. In fact, you may have found yourself at one point saying the exact same statement that disparaging myth, like myth is inconsequential, myth is insignificant, myth is primitive, mythology is for primitive peoples. What is the purpose of a myth? Myths are no longer relevant. This, I think, is a great danger. Joseph Campbell was very clear about the functions of the myth. The most powerful and compelling function of a myth is that it ties us to the numinous, the ineffable, the unspeakable, the mystical experience, that experience of oneness, that experience of God, that experience by many name, that transcendent experience. Of course, in science, that transcendent experience doesn't necessarily present itself in the reductionistic paradigm that we find ourselves. There isn't much beyond the physical world. There isn't much beyond the mechanistic world of atoms and brain cells. So the power of myth, I have posted recently on Instagram, is that it is a language of the soul. Mythology is the language that the soul communicates, just as dreams are the language that the soul communicates. They are not for the rational mind to interpret. We could be very easily frustrated if we take our very analytic mind and bring it to bear on interpreting a myth. It will drive us absolutely nuts. It will be meaningless. The world of myth and the world of interpreting myth and dream is much more visceral and much more intuitive, requires a different sensitivity. The second function of a myth is that it ties us to a cosmological perspective. We are currently embedded in a very narrow band of reality. Every ancient culture up until about 300 to 400 years ago was embedded in a much larger framework in society, in community, but then expanding into nature, and then from nature to the planet, from Gaia, and from there into the cosmos. Seeing oneself embedded in this is why the astrologers were so compelling, astrology and astronomy for so many centuries, because the interplay between the what is above and below helped give people bearing as to what comes next in their, how should they make decisions, what should they expect, what does the solstice mean in terms of what kind of way to live, what eclipses mean. What long cycles, like the Mayan calendar long cycle, these very, very long cycles tell a story about human beings, how they should live. A myth also has something to tell us about how we should live within small communities and tribes. It often has within their architecture. They're often giving principles about how best to live in harmony with others. And finally, a good myth teaches you how to live a good life. Sometimes these things are not obvious. Sometimes this is why it's represented that they are principles delivered from on high. A mountain peak, for example, where tablets, a burning bush as an intermediary provides a codex in which human beings should live. This is just one example of the power of myth. As I continue, then, I'm going to ask us to think about various lenses of interpretation. I don't suggest that any one of these is primary. I think actually an interdisciplinary approach is really, really constructive. It's been very helpful for me to see a lot of the commonality from different disciplines looking at mythology. Everyone acts out of a myth, but very few people know what their myth is. And you should know what your myth is, because it might be a tragedy, and maybe you don't want it to be. So I don't know how many of you could raise your hand, but as a therapist, what I sometimes see myself as is as an archaeologist. People come with what's called the presenting problem. And what we try to do together is go into the deep recesses of the unconscious to discover the cave paintings, the deep mythology from childhood and from ancestry that is informing itself in a replication over and over again in contemporary time, in real time. And this is why Jung is very powerfully saying, learn your mythology, because whether you like it or not, it is in control of your destiny right now, and it may not be the mythology you want playing out. So the first lens that I think is a very powerful one that I'm using as a kind of framework in the new book, is this one that we discovered in the Return with the Elixir course 3, Salvea Coagula, to dissolve and to reemerge or to reassemble. This is a very ancient principle. It is Latin, and it comes out of the alchemical tradition much later, but it is found all the way back to pre-dynastic Egypt and before. Any kind of mystical culture, what we would now call a wisdom tradition, has as its framework the possibility that a human being can dissolve its constituent parts, go into a kind of amorphous state, a state of dissolution or near death, and reconfigure itself into a more transcendent or more aligned being. So I gathered a couple of cross-cultural images to articulate this. This image here is from the more recent alchemical tradition, which was sort of Western magic that has its roots in Egyptian culture. And these 4 stages, I think, to me, if I explain them very cursorily, some of you will find some familiarity with our Tibetan death process. The process of these 4 spheres are symbolic for the blackening, the whitening, the yellowing, and the reddening. The blackening is the death process. The whitening is the transition, the purification. This is of consciousness. And then the 3rd and 4th can be subdivided, or they're emblematic of a reconstituting. The highest pinnacle of it is the ascension as a spiritual being. So this is transposed on the physical world by alchemists who are looking to dissolve base metals and cook them up, if you will, in order to create gold. But really what it is a process of spiritual dissolution, taking the aggregates, what the Buddhists would call the basic fundamentals of mind, going through a process of purification, and then reconfiguring them anew. You'll see there the phoenix rising. This is another one of the reconstitution from in the alchemical urn. These are all very potent symbols. But if you start looking at rituals across culture, they all have this idea of a descent, a transmutation or a transfiguration, and an ascent. So the prostration, or the baptism. Or in yoga, this is a ritual purification by fire. The yogi surrounds himself in a pit of fire. I mean, basically cooking oneself in order to find within one the latent capacities of mind necessary for freedom that would have ordinarily remained obscured or inactive. So there needs to be trial in order for there to be treasure. If we take that same idea or concept and we go into the world of psychology and we take Jung's map, I'm going to start to divide each of these perspectives into categories of 3. And then once we get to the myth of Demeter and Persephone, I want you to think about these 3. So in the mysticism, the 3 are death, purification, and transformation. And in Jung's psychology, we have a trinity. The trinity is the regular or the obvious or the ordinary ego. Now, don't think of ego as something that you have to get rid of. The ego is like an organizing principle. It is the agent of consciousness, the gatekeeper, including the persona, the mask that we show others. So all of that, which we're conscious of, represents a very, very small little band of our identity. But it's the one that operates in the world. It's the one that is interacting and behaving and acting as an agent in the world. Then there is the descent into the shadow. And the shadow represents a much broader portion of the psyche, of the soul. The word psyche comes from the Greek and it actually means soul. So psychologists actually are tenders to the soul. In the shadow are those things, or those aspects of our personality, of our psyche, of our soul that we have not become familiar with, have not attended to, have not become conscious of. And oftentimes it gets a very bad rap for being all the disenfranchised, neglected, and despicable or despised bits of us. But that's actually not true. The shadow also includes all the, how many of you yourself, or how many people you know, also can't really accept their divinity. For example, any praise that you might get, you deflect. Any of you like that? Raise your hand. Don't like to receive any praise? Hard to receive any praise? Anybody at all? Nobody, huh? I'm one of those people. It's a challenge for me to accept any praise without thinking that it is has either malintent or is, there's going to be another shoe that drops, or there's a lot of fear around it, suspicion. This is because in the recess of the deep shadow, there hasn't been brought to bear a sufficient level of self-acceptance. The self-acceptance not only of the unwanted bits, but also of the goodness, what Trungpa might call the basic goodness. So we start from the top of the prostration in the ego, and we make a descent into the shadow, into the netherworld, with the idea that at the outskirts of the shadow are not only the personal material from childhood, that, let's say, the traumas from childhood is just an example, but then there is also another threshold which breaches into the transpersonal realm. Now, this could include ancestry. It's also the place where there are the archetypes. The archetypes are the symbols, the symbolic language of universals. The mind at this level isn't speaking in words. The mind at this level is speaking in symbol. And these symbols transcend culture. They transcend time and epoch. They are universal. Jung thought that one of the chief archetypes was this notion of self, not self with a small s, but self with a large large S. And really, this can be understood best as a metaphor for integration. The transcendent self is not a self that disenfranchises the earth in order to reach heaven. It's a self that integrates heaven with hell. Do you follow? The idea of the self is that it's fully integrated, and Jung thought that Christ was highly emblematic of what the archetype of self represents. Someone who was both human and divine. Somebody who had full agency to their anger, for example, in the stories of Christ, when he destroys there's a story of Christ where the moneylenders outside the temple. Somebody who's in touch with their passion, somebody who's in touch with their rage, somebody who's skillful, who doesn't dissociate elements of their personality, but can bring them into a totality. This is what is meant by the self as integration. I think interestingly, though I sometimes have disparaging comments for science, science itself can also be mythological. So this is a mythological interpretation of science and where we are, I think, right now. What if it was that we could divide the nervous system again into threes? So in the mystical lens, we have death, purification, transformation. In the psychological lens, we have ego, shadow, self. In the neurological lens, what if we have left, right hemispheres and integration? The left hemispheres, could these be emblematic of the ordinary world? The left is associated with language and with linear thought, analytic thought, executive functioning. It's very detail-oriented. Without it, we couldn't analyze things into smaller bits and in order to gain some firm confirmation of reality. On the other side, the right hemisphere is associated with gestalts, big pictures, broad brushstrokes, senses, emotions, images, dreams, right down into trauma, intuitions. I'm just thinking now the pendulum swing from 300 to 400 years ago towards science also has a great suspicion towards the right brain. It deems it irrational, hysterical, chaotic. True science, true analysis is the new religion. Everything else is heretical. There's no place for the language of the soul. There's no place for mythology. There's very little place for dance, chaos, ecstasy. Enter in the new trauma studies and the new psychotherapies. These are using neuroscience to suggest something different, an alternative, a restoring or a reclaiming or a integrating between hemispheres using the vagus nerve, and suggesting that our goal in trauma is to singe back, reclaim, reunite both hemispheres. But not only that, not a left-right only, but also a top-down. Could the vagus nerve be almost a mythopoetic descent into, or pilgrimage, a pilgrimage to reclaim the soul, down through the heart and into the intelligence that exists in the gut intelligence, so that we become full embodied, fully sensate, fully aware, fully reclaimed and integrated beings, and then restoring a sense of wholeness. This is a kind of mythopoetic view of the nervous system. Let's go into the archetypes for a second. Dreams is personalized. A dream is a personalized myth. A myth is a depersonalized dream. Both myth and dream are symbolic in the same general way of the dynamics of the psyche. But in the dream, the forms and quirked by the particular troubles of the dreamer, whereas in myth, the problems and solutions shown are directly valid for all mankind. So think about your dream are a message from your soul, beckoning your attention to reclaim or reassert something missing in your life. Whereas a myth is a universal message for all of us to do the very same thing, to reclaim, reassert, and return to life. So when we go through the myth in just a minute here, you can think about the archetypes as psychological aspects. For example, here I have just a few of them: the king, the warrior, the magi or the wizard or the magician, and the lovers. It doesn't matter what culture, it doesn't matter what time period, these are universal. They may come in different shapes, sizes, and colors, but they're all there. They all have very profound, encoded meaning deep in the psyche. Without ever having come across these, they're already there, lying in wait. And in a way, they get magnetized at the right time, but we haven't been trained, really, at least not most of us, haven't been trained to recognize them and understand what their calling is, what their prompting is. We too easily just collapse and dismiss them. On the other hand, the myth. What if the myths are a kind of story or narration of particular dynamics for us to live by or live through? So we're about to get into Demeter and Persephone, and I'd like, before we do, for you to prime you to start to think about your own life experience in the midst of COVID and the pandemic. What kind of interactions, what kind of reactions, what kind of interplays you've been prone to. And once you start to see those dynamics playing themselves out, what if myths were stories to help prime your mind into a different kind of experience in order to see and live differently, no matter the challenge? Okay. Rebirth. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of the supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his or her fellow man or woman or humankind. This is one of the best little quotes I could find, sort of priming us as to the power of the rebirth archetype, which I think, by now and with our class 3 Return with the Elixir, we'll all be very familiar with what Joseph Campbell was really pointing to with his hero's journey, or the monomyth with its 12 or 17 stages. They can all be condensed into the tripartite separation, initiation, and return. The idea is that we all start in the ordinary world, quote unquote, the ego, perhaps the left brain. Some catalyst or portal is open that thrusts us into the netherworld, the initiation. This sends us into the right brain or the underworld. In the underworld, something is reclaimed in the midst of a battle with a great dragon or a great demon or a great trauma or a great ancestral legacy. I love that image of the dragon, by the way. The dragon is often guarding the treasure. And the dragon represents some part of our mind that we have neglected. Something in us that we want dead and buried, that we wanted to deny, that we want to no longer exist. And all the while that we don't want to deal with it, we don't want to remember it, we have been feeding it underground, and it has swelled until it becomes a vast creature. And then comes the time for the hero. The hero eventually, whether they're willing or not, has to have this great confrontation. This is the more heroic or masculine version of the story. There's also the feminine version of the story where the dragon has also swelled because of neglect. But the great heroine, instead of destroying and slaying the dragon in order to reclaim the treasure, what she does is she tames the dragon so she can fly it. So in the recent, what was her name? Someone unmute and give me a prompt for it's not Lord of the Rings, it's the...
Game of Thrones.
Yes, and what was her name?
I'm forgetting her name.
The Targaryen? What?
Daenerys.
Oh, yeah. So Daenerys is the mother of dragons. And everybody's afraid of the dragon. Everybody fears the dragon. The male comes to slay the dragon in order to claim his victory, in order to earn respect from the tribe. He has to confront that which nobody willingly confronts. For the feminine archetype hero, she finds her own way to charm, tame, lure, and convince the dragon to work on her behalf, and thus she claims her power. And so the dragon and the treasure are really one archetype. They're not separate. They come together. And once you claim the power from the thrust of its oppositional force in your psyche, that which you don't want to deal with, that's what you deny, that which you repress, that which you condemn. I was working with this young guy the other day in my therapy. He's had a lot of trauma, and he uses I don't want to give away his name, so he uses I'll just say let's say his name is James, but he uses Jimmy to describe his inner child. And he said the other day, Jimmy is dead and buried. I have buried him a long time ago. Jimmy is dead and buried. And of course, what we know is nothing is dead and buried. Nothing is forgotten. In fact, what we have done in relegating things to the unconscious has only further empowered it, so that little Jimmy is exerting his control over the psyche, creating reverberations. So the goal of therapy is to undead Jimmy and embrace Jimmy. Bring Jimmy into integration. Reclaim him from the graveyard. And that is the return home. Once the ordeal and the reward phases of the initiation are done, then there is the return home, which, as many of you know from returning from pilgrimage, for example, the departure is very difficult, but there's nothing more difficult than returning home. That's why Erica has set quickly back off on another adventure. She's not yet ready to return home. The return is a very difficult period because the world hasn't changed. Only you have changed. So where do you fit in? And who's going to believe you? And you have new vision and new sight, and everybody else is blind. You have been initiated. You have reclaimed some power. And you cannot bestow that power. Everyone has to make the descent. So then how do we live together? Those that have returned with the elixir. Well, this is what the Buddha discovered, is you can't go on a missionary quest to create converts. You just have to be a beacon. And by the force of karma, you will attract certain people, and then you will teach them. Okay. The myth of Demeter and Persephone is a very intricate one. I'm by no means adept at telling the full story. There are actually a couple of different versions of the story. I'm just going to, again, use it in a kind of very selective way to demonstrate some of the lenses that we've already covered. Demeter is the mother. She's the mother goddess. She's the goddess of grain. And her daughter, Persephone, is the queen of the dead. And this myth tells the tale of the two. There are 3 acts in the myth of Demeter. It starts with Persephone, who at the time is not called Persephone, she's called Kore, which means maiden. She's very young and beautiful and innocent. She's the archetype of the young youth, the innocent youth. This is the ego. This is the Shire. The mythology starts with her picking flowers in a field. She's alone. And if I remember correctly, the kind of flower that the myth talks about is called a narcissus. I could be mistaken about that. There's some debate whether that actual plant has psychotropic or psychoactive potentials. That will become possibly important later in the story. So Act 1 of the 3 parts of the myth is called the Abduction. You see the young, innocent maiden, idealized, dreaming in what Freud might call the infantile narcissism, swimming in the cosmic ocean of the Shire where everything is perfect, everything is beautiful. This is the Buddha, Siddhartha, in the palace, where there is nothing, there's no suffering. And she's picking this flower, and just like in Alice in Wonderland, she uproots a flower, and the flower turns into a deep hole, and that deep hole becomes tunnel-like or portal-like, and out of that portal emerges Hades. Hades is the lord of death, or the lord of the underworld. And he falls madly in love with her, and he abducts her. Now, some of these scenes of abduction are really, they can vary from luring her and deceiving her to outright raping her. Very graphic. This is important because in each of one of your stories, I'm sure, there was a radical seismic shift in consciousness between your childlike innocence and a severe disruption of it. Some force greater than yourself came along and disrupted your innocence. Could simply have been life in a passive way. We all have to grow up. We all have to grow up, take responsibility, and leave the Shire. It could have happened in a much more destructive and devastating way. And you could have been pulled asunder. Now, using one of the lenses of what's taking place here is that you're getting pulled asunder from order into chaos, from the left into the right brain, from the ordinary world into the netherworld, into the shadow, into the shadowlands, and where one is assailed by all the realities that we have tried to keep at bay. A really powerful part of this first act is that despite the loss of innocence, hear this out, despite the tumultuous, painful loss of innocence, Kore does become queen of the underworld. She takes her rightful seat next to Hades and assumes the throne of the underworld. What I'd like to just say here is that through her trial, she found her treasure. She found her power. She found her place. She resides over the unconscious. She masters the unconscious. And the descriptions of her in her supremacy is that she becomes a very feared and respected goddess in her own right. So much so that people make offerings and libations and all kinds of acts of respect to her, not only for their ancestors, but for their own soul. And she's this kind of archetype that, just like in Egyptian mythology, there's a great kind of moment where the soul has an accounting. Well, guess who you go to for your accounting of your soul? You go through the doors of Persephone. So this is a very powerful archetype of the power of making a crisis, turning a crisis into a transmutation. From abduction, great power is seized. Now that whole abduction, like for those of us that are still stuck in a victim stance, that victimization is very compelling and filled with a lot of force, but it is disenfranchising and disempowering, and it keeps us stuck. There's some way that crisis can be channeled into opportunity, and that is for each of us to figure out how. Act 2 is the search. While Persephone is discovering her power, her latent, and activating her latent power above ground, the mother goddess, is mourning the loss of her daughter. She can't find her anywhere. So here in this beautiful relief, you see this figure here is Demeter, and she's got her head down. She's a god in her own light, but she's in mourning. This is Aphrodite and Eros, and supposedly Eros holds a scale, which is missing in this relief, and he's measuring out how much time, he's weighing out the time frame until Persephone returns. Could be eons. So she's kind of stuck in her paralysis here, her stasis. So the mythology continues that she has no way. She searches for 9 days and is not able to find her daughter. She has no idea where she is. And she then on the 9th day discovers from another goddess, Hecate, that it reads like the message is delivered through the grapevine. I saw, she said, he said, that she was pulled under by Hades, and when it comes to Demeter's ears that her daughter was stolen by Hades and that Zeus was complicit, because they're all a kind of family, she feels enormously betrayed, and she's angered. So she decides to leave Mount Olympus, still in a kind of disempowered or impoverished way, and she wanders into the city of Eleusis. And she finds there a well, and she cloaks or disguises herself as a simple peasant woman, and she mourns by this well. And unbeknownst to her, the queen of Eleusis comes and sees her weeping and takes pity on her, and sits by her and consoles her, and then invites her back to her palace, and actually gives her the job of being the maiden or the maid or the nanny, if you will, of the princes. And in this process, the narrative goes that by night, as a kind of reciprocity with the kindness showed to her by the queen and king, she starts to secretly initiate the little baby infant, the prince, into an initiation into by trial of fire. She starts burning the child at night, burning the impurities in order to make him immortal. And of course, this takes a little while. And then one night, unbeknownst to her, the queen comes in and is horrified to catch her burning the little infant, and screams at her. And she's so offended that she's being screamed at because she knows she's a goddess. She undisguises herself and shows herself in her full wrath. So in a way, she is spurred into remembering who she actually is. It's almost like she fell asleep in her paralysis. She fell asleep in her despair. And she is activated, reminded, through indignation in a way, that she's a goddess. And she demands that the king and queen apologize and build her a temple at Eleusis. And which, of course, horrified that they have spurred the goddess, they quickly build that beautiful temple at Eleusis in her name. All the while she's in this temple, up to a year, she continues a little bit with her despair. And she recognizes very slowly that in her disempowerment, since she is goddess of the grain, she hasn't tended to the crops, and the crops have failed. And people start to starve. And then the penny drops, because Zeus comes knocking and says, please, Demeter, please, fulfill your obligation. You are the goddess of the grain. Don't leave people hungry. They're going to blame me. And there she discovers and finally reclaims her power, because she recognizes she's instrumental in the maintenance of order. In the grand scheme of things, she has so much power. So she strikes a bargain with Zeus. Any feminist would love this story. She gives it to Zeus and says, damn it, I won't do a thing until you give me what I want. Give me back my daughter or else. So this is a moment of reclaiming her power above ground, pushing back on Zeus. Zeus goes to Hades, confronts Hades, says, you got to give Persephone back. In the moments before he gives Persephone, he concedes. In the moments he gives Kore back, he deceives her by giving her some pomegranate seeds. And if you eat these pomegranate seeds, you are forevermore tethered to the underworlds. In some stories, she eats one seed. In some stories, she eats 6 seeds. And so the bargain is struck that Persephone can leave the underworld, but she must return. She is tied to the underworld for the amount of seeds per month. So she has to return 6 months of the year. So half the year she has to be above ground with her mother, reunited with her mother, and half the year she returns as queen of the dead. And here we have Act 3, the rapprochement, the return of mother and daughter, the goddess of the grain with the queen of the underworld. And what happens in the return is that both of them are now more empowered as a result of their trial. And one of the queen's sons, one of the princes of Eleusis, Triptolemus, becomes the heir of Persephone and Demeter. And they teach him and they initiate him in the sacred art of agriculture. And they instruct him to be their first missionary, to go and teach Greece and beyond the art of agriculture. And so this little, this relief here, this beautiful relief here of Triptolemus standing between the goddesses, the first initiation into the art of agriculture. And here, this relief, Triptolemus is often described or depicted flying a chariot driven by serpents. And if you're anything like me, you love that mythological symbolism. Of course, the serpents and the dragons, very deep, deep symbolism. And also the chariots. I wrote in another Instagram post, if you start looking at mythology, there's always a charioteer, a messenger between worlds, between a liminal being, someone who drives a chariot between worlds, like the charioteer of Siddhartha, and also of Krishna is the charioteer of Arjuna. So what can we glean from the mythology? There are 3 acts: the trial, the discovery, and the renewal of power, and the integration and the bestowing of gifts. And then there are 2 lessons or 2 dimensions of this myth. One is this myth then becomes a origin story for the seasons and the harvest. 6 months of the year is the land is barren. Then they start planting. Then the plant reaps fruit. Then there is celebration, renewal of life, harvest, bounty, and then it begins again. Then decay. Persephone returning to the underworld. Demeter languishing in sorrow. Months of separation. The word languishing was used by Lynn Bell in our long stretches of the pandemic. But it's not a terminal case. There is the return. The seasons do change. They adjust. There is an insight, a moment of recognition. There is a reclaiming of power. The seasons turn again. Summer comes, then spring, and on. The subtle interpretation of the myth is a codex for immortality. This isn't about a terminal life perspective. Up until these mystery schools, ancient Greece had the notion that once you died, and your spirit went forevermore into the underworld. It's only through these mystical traditions that a different type of interpretation occurred, one of rebirth, that there wasn't any kind of stasis in any one realm, but that your soul returned in order to continue its evolution and its growth. And then it would die, and then you'd have a return, and you'd learn a little bit more. We would call this the gradual process of awakening. Okay, now we can get into the mysteries. Some of you are going to have to run off. I'm going to run over time. This is recorded, and so you can enjoy the rest of it if you need to leave. Sorry I didn't time it well enough, but this is the last little leg here. These are the initiatory rites, or what are called the mysteries or the mystical cults attributed to this mythology that enacted themselves in ancient Greece for a period of 2,000 years. This is how human beings actually took the mythology and lived it out. Each year, they would live out the mythology, embody the mythology of the demise, the sorrow, the languishing, the reclaiming, and the return. A ritual enactment in order to alter consciousness and in order to transform alchemically the human being. And this is along what is called the sacred way. So those of you who may be aware of Brian Maurescu's new book, The Immortality Key, which is a reference for some of these images, and also the pilgrimage that we're about to go on, and before Brian's book, the book by Ruck, Hoffman, and Wasson, The Road to Eleusis. So I just remember this powerful image here, this relief of the 2 goddesses with Triptolemus, the first initiate found at Eleusis, is the beginning point. It's a drama that played out with the gods that then became the lineage source of actual human affairs. There are 3 types of pilgrimage. Some of you have been on at least 2 of them with me. There is an outer pilgrimage of a journey to a sacred destination, an actual physical location. There is an inner pilgrimage that one embarks on by going inside. So think about Jung's triad of ego, shadow, self. And then there is what's called the secret pilgrimage, which we could combine with the neurological pilgrimage of embodiment, the secret pilgrimage of the subtle body, drawing the energies from both side channels down into the sacred chalice in order to be reconfigured and then drawn up the center Sushumna so that they can then reside at the center heart chakra and merge with the indestructible drop, which gives access, they say, to the deathless state. Perhaps we could superimpose the neurological one of the left brain moving to the right brain, down through the vagus nerve into the gut, and then back up into full integration. The actual sacred geography of the Eleusinian mysteries start in Athens and end in Eleusis. And Eleusis, you can see from the map, what they would do is there were 2 mysteries. There was the lesser mystery and the greater mystery. The lesser mystery happened every year and occurred sometime in February and involved a recanting of the myth of Demeter and Persephone and involved some sort of ritual purifications. It involved sacrifices. It involved bathing. It involved, it was kind of a more moderate initiation. And then there was the greater initiation, which they say happened every year, and with a bigger one happening every 4 years. Sacred objects at the temple of Eleusis were brought down the sacred way to Athens, where all the pilgrims would gather. They say that anybody who spoke Greek and hadn't committed a heinous crime like murder was allowed to participate in the initiations. If they had the lesser, then they could graduate to the greater. That was quite extraordinary at the time because that included women, it includes slaves, it included children. They could all participate. They would start at the Acropolis, and this would take 10 days. And I'm not going to go through each of the 10 days, but you can imagine several days of purification, several days of offerings, including offerings to Asclepius, etc. Asclepius, the god of healing. They had a whole day devoted just to him. It would be the same for us to do a whole puja for Medicine Buddha, for example. They would all walk down to the shore and do a ritual bathing. They would bring a little piggy with them. They would bathe the piggy as an effigy and offer the piggy. And then they would start day 3, day 4, can't remember, start fasting. And they would start this hike to Eleusis, which I think is somewhere on the order of 14 miles, half marathon. So this is the outer pilgrimage. Preparation and departure, Act 1. Now this is taking the myth and bringing it into life. This is living the myth. Some of the road to Eleusis or the sacred way still exists today. This little lower one here is a bridge that they would cross, and it's said that the villagers around this area would come to the base of the bridge, and as the pilgrimage retinue or the lineage or the line of the initiates would be walking in procession. Once they hit this bridge, they would mock them and chastise them and throw things at them. And this is a kind of symbol of, are you really ready? Are you sure you want to do this? Because you're crossing a bridge now. Very metaphoric. Are you ready to go deeper? Are you testing them? What Joseph Campbell might call test enemies and allies. This is the great doorway to the propylaea. I think this is a smaller propylaea here, but I love this image here because you can see these little grooves where these huge doors would swing open. And I just love the metaphor of a gateway, crossing a threshold. So you've made it through many days of celebrations and purifications and fasting. You've walked 14 miles. You're probably somewhat delirious, and you find yourselves at the gate. And at the gate, there are images of Persephone and Demeter with the harvest baskets over their head, carrying the sacred harvest or bounty, the crop which represents new life. These are images of what's called the telestrion, and this is where the great initiation would take place. Not much of it exists anymore. This is what it looks like now. You can see it's an enormous site. There's the things that I read said that there were as many as 2,000 to 3,000 people in the procession that entered at any one time. So you can imagine, I mean, I've been in Bodh Gaya where we had an initiation with 30 or 40,000 people with the Dalai Lama. And it's a very powerful experience to be with that many people in one place undergoing an initiation. So, sacred reenactment. Anyone can recognize what this is here? This is indeed the well where Demeter was disguised there as a nanny and mourning the return. This is the cave. Okay, and they set up a temple here because they use this cave as a symbol of the descent and the return from Hades. So imagination is very, very powerful, but compellingly, Brian Marescu in his recent book, Immortality Key, says the imagination may not have been compelling enough because for 2,000 years, whatever initiation took place there remained a secret, completely changed people's lives forevermore. Great, great people all were initiated into the mysteries, and all of them kept it secret. And you have to wonder what could be so profound and so compelling that for 2,000 years not a single bit of information exists about what actually took place in the Telestrion with 2,000 people every single year. Brian's book is compelling. It suggests that the sacrament that was drunk at the Telestrion included ergot. And ergot is a fungus that grows on wheat. It's a psychedelic fungus. The assertion is that the priestesses who had the direct knowledge of their true secret initiation given by Demeter and Persephone to Triptolemus, what it actually was not just about a story about the seasons and of harvest and of the secrets of harvest, but actually of cooking a potion with psychedelic substance in order for initiates to gain access into the deathless state of immortality. So it's suggested that they were initiated into a psychedelic journey. And what they discovered is that there is no terminal death, that their soul was immortal, continuously returning, and it is said that that abated any fear. No more fear. Once you directly see who you really are and why you're here, you have discovered everything that there is to discover about the human situation. You are free. So this is the contention of what the Eleusinian mysteries were really about. Discovering your latent power in context. In the context of the cosmos, in the context of society, and in the context of who and what you are, your purpose, all at the same time. Inside Demeter's temple, fragrant with incense, there were things said, there were things enacted, and there were things seen. Probably the Homeric hymn to Demeter was chanted by the priestesses of Demeter and the Hierophant, who was said to have a most sweet voice. The priestesses and priests, along with the initiates, reenacted portions of the sacred drama of the mother and daughter. A communion drink called the kekion, made of boiled barley and water and mint, was shared. A brass gong sounded. A great fire blazed forth inside the temple. The highest stage of initiation, an epoptia, a vision, a special state of seeing, was received. This little footnote here by the author, she has a very compelling description of all the 10 days of the ritual, which if you're interested, you can pursue her, Mary Lynn Keller. You can Google her short paper on the ritual path of initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries. So these are some of the artifacts that were discovered at Eleusis. I won't go into detail about them, but very beautiful. This basket, the harvest basket, containing not only the obvious or the literal harvest, but also the fungi and the sacrament in which provided the deathless state. I just want to make reference that somewhere in the 4th century AD, the incursion of Christianity came in and basically ended the pagan rituals and the rites that had lasted 2,000 years. And in a way, the rituals, the procession and some of the rituals remained, but in a way they have lost some of their vitality. But if you look at sacred art, all of the stages of the initiation are there. The great sacrament of water and wine, which in his book Immortality Key, even Brian is suggesting that the early Christians still used spike wine to have a psychedelic experience of immortality. You have the death. When Christ is crucified, he takes a descent into hell, where he spends 3 days atoning and retrieving all the lost souls, which are, in a way, can be imagined as disenfranchised parts of himself, because the Christ represents true integration. Here he's reclaiming parts of himself that have been blasphemed to hell. Here he is arising 3 days later, after the coming out of the tomb. Then there is the ascension, and then there is the trifecta between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now I think Hecate, Demeter, and Persephone represent the trifecta, the maternal trifecta that preceded the paternal one, with the mother, the daughter, and the intermediary Hecate. That's just a suspicion of mine. Okay. Here we have what some of you might recognize as this is the procession. This is what's left of the procession. Okay, these are the remnants of separation of the initiation. All symbolic now, drawing on just your imagination. And then the gathering or the return of people after the communion. Okay, who's up for a pilgrimage in 2023? You can write me and let me know if you're keen. I'd like to go. It's definitely a lot easier to travel through Greece than it is India or Nepal. Okay, guys, that's it. Hopefully that's not too late. I'll let you ponder, metabolize, consider. Next week when you come into the courtyard, you can have a little forum, what Ian Baker called the agora, and you can use courtyard for a little exchange on what your impressions were. Thank you so much for indulging me. I hope it was compelling in some form. I just want to say the whole point of all this is where are you in your own thinking and relating to the extraordinary circumstances that we're undergoing right now. Hopefully you are mythologizing your experience, finding the treasure, and coming home with the boon. Okay. Thank you.
Take care, Miles. See you next week.
All right.
Yay. Looking forward to Wednesday.
Oh, goody.
Yeah.
Yes, I am too.